3 in the morning. Andersen Air Force Base, Guam. 6 B-52 Stratofortress bombers were already taxiing toward the primary runway, their massive wings sagging visibly under the weight of 70,000 pounds of internal and external munitions. This was not a dynamic force employment exercise, or a routine presence patrol designed to signal intent to regional adversaries. For the first time in over 30 years, the heavy bombers of the United States Air Force were rolling toward the takeoff point with full loads of live, unguided gravity bombs and precision-set sea mines meant for a moving surface target. The humid tropical air was thick with the scent of burnt JP-8 fuel and the deafening, earth-shaking scream of 48 Pratt & Whitney engines firing in sequence. 1,500 miles to the west, the target was already in motion. Across the choppy, dark waters of the Taiwan Strait, a massive convoy of 60 civilian roll-on, roll-off vessels and heavy military transports moved in a rigid, three-column formation. Inside the cavernous, reinforced holds of those ships sat the primary strike force of the People's Liberation Army. 300 Type 99, a main battle tanks, and over 400 infantry fighting vehicles, all fueled and crewed for a sunrise landing. The strait was a corridor of tension, and the Chinese fleet moved with the confidence of a force protected by a dense umbrella of shore-based missiles. Neither the crews in the cockpits over Guam nor the tank commanders in the hulls over the water knew exactly how the next 4 hours would reshape the geography of the Pacific, but the momentum of the machine was now irreversible. In the lead B-52 Stratofortress, designated Scalpel 1-1, the aircraft commander gripped the control yoke with hands that were damp despite the air conditioning. He had spent 20 years flying circles over deserts and maritime highways, but the weight of the aircraft today felt different. It was sluggish. A predatory beast laden with enough high explosives to turn a square mile of ocean into a cauldron of fire. Behind him, the radar navigator checked the digital displays, watching the synchronized icons of the 5 other bombers in the flight. They were moving at intervals of exactly 60 seconds, a heavy metal parade launching into a moonless sky. The horizon was a black void, indistinguishable from the sea, save for the flickering lights of the runway approach. The environment around the airfield was a sensory assault. The heat rising from the asphalt shimmered in the floodlights, distorting the silhouettes of the ground crews who stood back at a safe distance, their chests vibrating from the acoustic pressure of the engines. The sound was not a mere noise, it was a physical force that rattled the teeth of every man and woman on the flight line. As the lead bomber reached the threshold of the runway, the pilot pushed the throttles forward. The 8 engines roared into a singular, high-pitched howl, and the 85-ton aircraft began its slow, agonizingly heavy roll down the concrete. It took nearly 10,000 feet of runway before the wings finally generated enough lift to pull the steel Leviathan into the air, leaving behind a thick cloud of black exhaust that hung in the still, salty air of Guam. Simultaneously, on the deck of a Chinese transport ship named the Long March 64, a young tank sergeant sat in the dark interior of his Type 99A. The air inside the hold was stale, smelling of diesel fumes and the sweat of 50 other men packed into the steel space. He could feel the rhythmic thrum of the ship's massive engines through the soles of his boots. Outside, the Taiwan Strait was throwing 2-meter swells against the hull, causing the heavy armor to strain against the thick steel chains lashing them to the deck. His world was one of shadows and the green glow of tactical tablets. He had been told the crossing would be unopposed, that the American carriers were still 500 miles away, and that the sky belonged to the People's Liberation Army. What the sergeant did not know was that the strategy had shifted. The United States was not sending a carrier strike group into the teeth of the Chinese missile batteries. They were sending the old guard. The B-52 bombers were climbing to 30,000 feet, carving a path through the atmosphere that would take them north of the primary engagement zones. They were the long-range Scalpel, designed to bypass the peripheral skirmishes and strike directly at the heart of the invasion's logistics. The mission was simple in its brutality. If the armored column reached the beaches, the war was lost. Therefore, the armored column would never reach the beaches. As the 6 bombers leveled off and turned toward the west, the silence in the cockpits returned, broken only by the hum of the avionics, and the occasional burst of encrypted data over the long-range radio. The crews settled into the grim patience of a long-haul flight. They were 4 hours away from the release point. 4 hours away from dropping a carpet of iron that would turn the Taiwan Strait into the largest underwater graveyard of the 21st century. Below them, the Pacific was a vast, indifferent mirror, reflecting nothing but the cold stars above. The diplomatic cables had gone silent exactly 48 hours earlier. In the windowless, high-security briefing rooms of the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, the tactical maps were no longer updated with possibilities, but with certainties. The transition from a state of heightened tension to a state of total kinetic war had occurred not with a single explosion, but with the steady, massive movement of logistics. For decades, the Taiwan Strait had been defined by a fragile status quo, a line in the water that neither superpower dared to cross with intent. That line had dissolved when the first wave of cyber attacks crippled the undersea fiber optic cables connecting Taipei to the world, followed immediately by the departure of the Eastern Theater Command's primary invasion fleet from the ports of Ningbo and Fuzhou. This was the Red Horizon, a strategic nightmare where the sheer mass of the People's Liberation Army was being leveraged against the technical precision of the United States and its allies. The armored column currently transiting the strait was the center of gravity for the entire campaign. It was not merely a collection of ships, it was the heavy fist of the invasion. 300 Type 99 main battle tanks represented the elite of the Chinese ground forces, supported by 400 infantry fighting vehicles and thousands of specialized engineers. If this force established a lodgment on the western beaches of Taiwan, the island's defense would shift from a maritime intercept to a grinding, bloody war of attrition on land, a scenario the United States military was desperate to avoid. The geopolitical calculus was cold and unforgiving. Beijing had calculated that a rapid, overwhelming strike would present the world with a fait accompli before the international community could coordinate a meaningful response. By the time the B-52 bombers had cleared the runway at Guam, the invasion was already 12 hours into its execution. The air above the strait was a chaotic web of electronic warfare, with both sides attempting to blind the other's radar and sever the data links required for precision targeting. The environment was thick with the smell of ozone from high-powered jamming equipment and the salty, heavy air of a looming storm system moving in from the north. In Washington, the decision to deploy the Stratofortress fleet was seen as the final card in a high-stakes game. Using carrier-based aircraft alone would have been insufficient against the sheer volume of the transport fleet. The Navy's FA-18 Gulf Growler electronic attack aircraft were already in the air, orbiting just outside the range of Chinese surface-to-air missiles, their sole mission to carve a temporary hole in the enemy's sensory net. The strategy was to use the B-52 as a blunt instrument. While modern warfare often emphasized the surgical strike, the reality of stopping 700 armored vehicles on the water required the weight of iron that only the aging heavy bombers could provide. Below the flight path of the American bombers, the Chinese transport fleet moved with a mechanical precision that belied the terror of the men inside. The roll-on, roll-off vessels, many of them conscripted civilian cargo ships, were never designed for a combat environment. Their high, flat sides were massive radar targets, and their lack of internal compartmentalization meant that a single hull breach could lead to a catastrophic loss of stability. On the bridges of these ships, civilian captains worked alongside military liaisons, their eyes fixed on the green phosphor of their navigation radars. They were surrounded by Type 55 and Type 52D destroyers, which circled the slow-moving transports like wolves guarding a flock, their vertical launch systems loaded with hundreds of interceptor missiles. The sea itself seemed to mirror the tension. The waves in the Taiwan Strait were rising, the dark water churning into white foam as the wind picked up. The physical sensation for the soldiers inside the transports was one of constant, nauseating motion. The steel hulls groaned under the stress of the swells, a sound like a low, metallic moan that echoed through the vehicle decks. Every man knew that they were in the most vulnerable phase of the operation. On land, a tank is a fortress of steel and fire. On the water, inside a thin-skinned transport, It is merely 40 tons of dead weight waiting to be sent to the bottom. As the B-52 flight crossed the first of several invisible trigger lines in the sky, the American crews received a final encrypted burst from Pacific Command. The message was brief. The window of opportunity was opening. With a decoy swarm of cruise missiles launched from Bone B Lancer bombers further to the south, the Red Horizon was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a physical reality, a wall of steel and fire that the United States was about to strike with the full, unfiltered weight of its airborne artillery. The time for diplomacy had ended with the silence of the cables. The time for the rain of iron had begun. 4:30 in the morning. The center of the Taiwan Strait. The 60 ships of the amphibious task force formed a bridge of steel 10 miles long, stretching from the western horizon to the dark, predatory silhouettes of the lead destroyers. This was the Bridge of Fire, a massive logistics gamble, where the People's Liberation Army had conscripted every available civilian roll-on, roll-off vessel to ferry 300 Type 99A main battle tanks across a narrow, lethal corridor of water. The sky above the formation was a bruised purple, and the air carried the heavy, humid weight of a gathering storm, mixed with the sharp, industrial stink of thousands of gallons of marine diesel burning in the holds of the transport fleet. Each vessel, like the 150-meter-long cargo ship named the East Wind 7, had been hastily modified with reinforced steel deck plates and extra lashings to secure the 45-ton armored vehicles against the violent pitch of the sea. Below the waterline, the hulls groaned under the immense weight of the concentrated armor, creating a sound like a giant grinding its teeth that echoed through the lower vehicle decks where the young soldiers sat in the dark. The formation was tight, with only 500 meters of open water separating the massive hulls, creating a target-rich environment that stretched for miles across the choppy, black surface of the central strait. To protect this vulnerable line of supply, a screen of Type 55 destroyers and Type 054A frigates patrolled the flanks, their active radars scanning the sky for any sign of a high-altitude threat. The Chinese commanders knew that if the bridge held for another 3 hours, the first tanks would be rolling onto the concrete ramps of the captured ports, ending the maritime phase of the war and beginning the conquest of the island. Inside the East Wind 7, the tank crews performed one last check of their systems by the dim red light of the tactical lamps, the smell of hydraulic fluid and cold metal filling the cramped spaces between the rows of parked vehicles. They were part of a logistical miracle, a movement of heavy iron that relied entirely on the silence of the American bombers and the effectiveness of their own missile umbrella, which currently felt impenetrable under the canopy of the stars. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering, with over 12,000 personnel and 100,000 tons of equipment, moving as a single, coordinated organism through one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the planet. But the bridge was made of thin steel and civilian welds, a temporary structure that was never intended to survive a direct encounter with 70,000 pounds of high explosives falling from 30,000 feet. As the swells grew larger, the civilian captains on the bridges of the transports fought to maintain their stations, their eyes fixed on the blue glow of the station-keeping displays. They were professional mariners suddenly thrust into the center of a superpower collision, and the tension on the bridges was a physical weight that made every minute feel like an hour. The radio silence was absolute, a tactical necessity that left each ship feeling isolated in the vast, churning darkness of the strait, even as they moved within sight of their neighbors. High above, the electronic environment was a screaming chaos of white noise and false targets. But on the surface, the Bridge of Fire seemed serene, a steady progression of power moving toward an inevitable conclusion. The crews of the tanks below deck did not look at the water, and they did not look at the sky. They focused on the green displays of their fire control systems, waiting for the moment the ramps would drop, and the steel of the Bridge of Fire would touch the soil of the objective. They had no way of knowing that the first of the B-52 bombers had just reached its initial navigation point. less than 600 miles away and closing at 800 kilometers per hour. Their flight suits soaked through with sweat in the 85% humidity of the oppressive tropical night. Each B-52 Stratofortress required a dedicated team of 30 personnel to manage the complex, high-stakes sequence of fueling, arming, and final systems checks before the 400,000-pound aircraft could even begin its slow taxi toward the runway. The air was a thick, vibrating soup of sound and smell, dominated by the high-pitched whine of external power units, and the sweet, heavy scent of nearly 40,000 gallons of JP-8 jet fuel being pumped into the massive wing tanks. The logistics of the mission were staggering in their scale, requiring the coordination of thousands of tons of ordnance that had been moved from deep underground storage bunkers to the flight line in a continuous convoy of heavy trailers. Ordnance technicians, working under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, used specialized hydraulic lifts to hoist 500-pound Mark 82 unguided bombs into the cavernous internal bays of the aging bombers. Each aircraft was being turned into a flying warehouse of destruction, carrying a mix of 70,000 pounds of high explosives and precision-coated sea mines designed to be released in a single, devastating carpet of iron over the target area. To bridge the 1,500-mile gap between Guam and the Taiwan Strait, the mission relied on a delicate, invisible tether of aerial refueling, provided by a fleet of KC-135 Stratotankers. These tankers had launched hours earlier from alternative airfields in the Pacific, orbiting at 30,000 feet in designated refueling tracks to provide the fuel necessary for the heavy bombers to reach their release points and return home. This was the silent, often overlooked backbone of the long reach, where the success of the entire combat operation depended on the ability of two massive aircraft to connect a refueling boom while moving at 800 kilometers per hour in the dark. Inside the maintenance hangars, the sound of pneumatic wrenches and the clattering of heavy tool carts provided a rhythmic backdrop to the final preparations for the second wave of sorties. Strategic bombing on this scale was not merely a matter of pilots and cockpits, but a massive industrial effort that consumed spare parts, hydraulic fluid, and human endurance at an incredible rate over 24-hour cycles. The ground crews knew that the reliability of 40-year-old airframes depended entirely on their attention to detail, as even a single loose seal or a faulty sensor could force a multi-million-dollar mission to abort before it ever reached the combat zone. As the last of the bomb bay doors groaned shut and the safety pins were pulled from the massive external racks, the flight line entered a brief, deceptive moment of relative quiet before the next engine starts. The environmental cost of the operation was visible in the shimmering heat hazes rising from the asphalt and the dark streaks of rubber left by the heavy laden tires of the departing aircraft. For the men and women on the ground, the war was measured in the number of sorties generated and the weight of the steel sent west, a relentless cycle of labor that ensured the long reach of American air power remained a physical reality. The strategic objective was clear. The United States was leveraging its massive logistical depth to project a level of violence that no localized air defense could entirely suppress through attrition alone. By the time the lead bomber of the first wave made its first mid-air refueling contact, the second wave of B-52 Stratofortress bombers was already being placed, fueled on the ramps at Guam. The bridge of fire in the strait was about to meet a bridge of iron extending halfway across the Pacific, built by the exhausted ground crews and the massive industrial machine of the United States Air Force. 5:15 in the morning, 100 miles east of the Taiwan Strait. The electronic horizon was already screaming with the invisible ghosts of high-frequency interference, as 4 FA-18 Golf Growlers from the Carrier Strike Group took their stations. These aircraft were the shield, their specialized jamming pods emitting a concentrated wall of white noise, designed to blind the long-range eyes of the Chinese HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries ringing the coast. The air inside the cockpits felt charged with static, a phantom pressure that the pilots could sense through their flight suits, while the sea below remained a dark, churning mystery under the pre-dawn shadows. This was the opening move of the Suppression mission, a silent war of frequencies where a single millisecond of delay could mean the difference. between a successful jam and a radar-guided interceptor tearing through a fuselage. Operating in the dangerous gaps between the jamming strobes, 6 F-35 Bravo Lightning fighters moved in total radio silence, their internal bays carrying the precision-guided teeth of the strike. These stealth aircraft were the sword, using their advanced sensor suites to sniff out the thermal signatures and radar emissions of the enemy's mobile air defense units hidden among the coastal cliffs. The pilots watched their multifunction displays, where the battlefield was rendered as a clean, digital map of threats and opportunities, far removed from the physical reality of the salt spray and the screaming wind outside. They were hunting the double-digit SAM sites, the lethal gatekeepers that stood between the B-52 bombers and their target coordinates in the center of the strait. The tactical coordination was a masterpiece of multi-domain synchronization, requiring the Navy fighters to maintain a precise distance from the Air Force bombers, still 300 miles to the east. As the first Chinese radar signature pulsed with a high-intensity lock-on signal, the lead Growler pilot initiated the Magnum protocol, launching 2 AGM-88 HARM missiles into the darkness. The missiles streaked off the rails. With a sudden, violent hiss of solid-state propellant, their seeker heads homing in on the very radar energy intended to destroy them. The sky was briefly illuminated by the white-hot trails of the anti-radiation missiles, a sharp contrast to the dull, flickering lights of the Chinese transport fleet far below on the water. On the mainland, the Chinese air defense crews reacted with professional speed, shutting down their primary emitters and shifting to passive infrared tracking to avoid the incoming American fire. The environment became a deadly game of cat and mouse, where the F-35 Bravos used their low observable profiles to slip inside the engagement envelopes of the HQ-9 batteries, dropping 1,000-pound small-diameter bombs on the command and control vehicles. The physical sensation of the engagement was one of intense, vibrating G-forces and the muffled thud of distant explosions echoing through the canopy. Even as the pilots remained focused on the glowing symbology of their heads-up displays. Every minute the Navy aircraft held the corridor open cost thousands of pounds of fuel and pushed the mechanical limits of the airframes, but the window for the heavy bombers was finally clear. The suppression of enemy air defenses was not a total destruction of the threat, but a temporary suppression of the enemy's ability to coordinate a massed response against a high-altitude target. By the time the first wave of HARM missiles impacted their targets, the Chinese missile umbrella had been shredded into disconnected patches of coverage, leaving a 50-mile-wide gap directly over the center of the armored column. The shield had held, and the sword had cut a path through the red horizon, leaving the sky open for the arrival of the Iron Rain. The logistics of the SAYAD mission were as grueling as the combat itself, with the Growlers requiring constant data link updates from orbiting E-2 Charlie Hawkeye command aircraft to track the shifting locations of the mobile missile launchers. Each F-35 Bravo had to manage its limited internal ordnance with extreme discipline, ensuring that the most lethal threats were neutralized before the unguided gravity bombs of the Stratofortress fleet began their descent. As the sun began to hint at the horizon with a thin, blood-red line, the Navy pilots turned their noses toward the east, their missions accomplished, leaving the stage to the 6 massive bombers closing in at 800 kilometers per hour, 5:45 in the morning, the northern entrance of the Taiwan Strait. The 6 B-52 Stratofortress bombers leveled off at exactly 30,000 feet, their internal navigation systems slaved to a high-priority data stream from a hovering Global Hawk drone that was painting the lead Chinese transports with invisible infrared lasers. Inside the cockpit of Scalpel 11, the pilot felt the aircraft shudder as the massive internal bomb bay doors groaned open, exposing 40,000 pounds of high explosives to the freezing, thin air of the upper atmosphere. The environmental transition was immediate, the quiet hum of the avionics replaced by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the wind howling past the open steel cavern in the belly of the jet. The crew sat in a state of hyper-focused silence, their eyes locked on the digital countdown timers that were ticking toward the first release point. In the center of the armored column's primary transit lane, the master arm switch was flipped to the live position, and the bombardier in the lower deck of the lead Stratofortress pressed the release stud. triggering a sequence of mechanical locks that sent 30 tons of iron sliding into the dark void. The first wave of Mark 82 500-pound bombs shrieked off their racks, a cascading waterfall of steel that fell through the pre-dawn clouds like a solid curtain of judgment, leaving behind the faint, chemical smell of cold hydraulic fluid and the sharp ozone of the electronic release triggers. The bombs stabilized in the slipstream, their fins biting into the heavy, salt-laden air as they accelerated toward the bridge of fire 10 miles below, where the Chinese transport fleet remained oblivious to the thousands of pounds of kinetic energy descending at terminal velocity. The first 500-pound warhead punched straight through the thin civilian steel of the forward vehicle deck on the East Wind 7, detonating instantly among the rows of fueled Type 99A main battle tanks. The explosion was not a single sound, but a series of overlapping, violent ruptures that tore the midsection of the 150-meter ship completely open, sending a white-hot pressure wave through the confined space that compressed every bulkhead in the compartment. 6 tons of armored turret from a shattered tank were thrown 30 meters into the air, spinning like a coin before slamming back down through the hull and creating a massive breach that allowed the cold, churning waters of the strait to pour into the engine room in a deafening torrent. The ship buckled in the center, the keel snapping with a metallic scream that could be heard over the roar of the fire as secondary detonations from the tank ammunition lockers began to rip the superstructure apart from the inside out. On the surrounding vessels, the reaction was a frantic, uncoordinated surge of panic as captains slammed their engines into full reverse or swung their rudders hard to port to avoid the blossoming fireball of the lead transport. The crews of the nearby destroyers scrambled to their manual anti-aircraft guns, their faces bleached white by the searing glare of the burning wreckage, as they began to fire blindly into the empty, dark sky, their tracers carving useless red lines through the smoke. 2 of the smaller transport ships collided in the chaos, the bow of a cargo vessel grinding into the side of a troop carrier, and throwing hundreds of soldiers off their feet into the dark vehicle holds where the heavy armor was already shifting against its restraints. The physical sensation across the entire formation was one of overwhelming shock, as the vibration of the underwater explosions rattled the hulls of ships miles away and sent a visible tremor through the surface of the black water. A wall of thick, oily black smoke rose 500 meters into the air, masking the remaining ships of the column from the stars and smelling of burnt diesel, salt, and the acrid bite of high explosives. The East Wind 7 was already disappearing beneath the surface, leaving nothing but a churning vortex of fire and debris that glowed like a dying ember in the center of the pitch-black strait. The silence that followed the first wave of impacts lasted for exactly 4 seconds before the next series of detonations began to walk their way down the length of the 3-column formation, turning the organized invasion fleet into a fragmented line of burning targets. The first strike of the Iron Rain had been delivered with surgical brutality, and the bridge of fire was now a bridge of sinking steel, illuminated by the orange light of its own destruction. 5:50 in the morning. The center of the Taiwan Strait. The secondary flight of 3 B-52 Stratofortress bombers, designated Scalpel 1-2 through 1-4, banked into their final attack run over the heart of the shattered Chinese formation, their massive frames silhouetted against a sky turning the color of a fresh bruise. The internal rotary launchers inside the cavernous bomb bays spun with a heavy, rhythmic metallic clatter, cycling another 84 Mark 82 500-pound bombs into the release position, while the external racks beneath the wings hummed with the high-voltage electrical surge of the final arming sequence. The pilots adjusted their flight trim to compensate for the sudden, violent shifts in center of gravity as the mechanical racks clicked open, sending a second, even denser curtain of iron screaming toward the churning water at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. This was the saturation phase of the mission, a mathematical grid of destruction designed to walk across the remaining 40 transport vessels with the terrifying precision of a giant's footsteps, crushing everything in its path. One 2,000-pound Mark 84 bomb slammed directly onto the stern ramp of a heavy transport ship, the sheer kinetic energy of the impact buckling the massive steel door, before the warhead detonated and sent a fireball 300 meters wide through the entire length of the lower vehicle deck. 300. Type 99. A main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles were caught in a catastrophic chain reaction of exploding fuel and ammunition, their hulls glowing white-hot as the magnesium and phosphorus flares stored inside ignited in a blinding chemical glare that bleached the horizon white. The ocean itself seemed to boil under the pressure of the strikes, the shockwaves from the underwater detonations, lifting 10,000-ton ships clear out of the water before dropping them back into the abyss with a sound that cracked the eardrums of every survivor within 3 miles. From the edges of the slaughter, a Type 55 destroyer and 2 Type 052 Delta cruisers erupted with a desperate, frantic barrage of HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, their vertical launch cells vomiting thick white smoke and orange flame into the air. The radar-guided interceptors tore through the oily black smoke of the burning fleet, their seeker heads struggling to find a target lock amidst the massive infrared signatures of the sinking transports and the concentrated electronic jamming. From the Navy Growlers orbiting at the edge of the zone, one Chinese captain, realizing the air defense umbrella had been completely compromised, ordered his manual close-in weapon systems to spray the sky with thousands of rounds of 20mm tungsten. The tracers, creating a futile, glittering web of light that fell short of the high-altitude bombers by 20,000 feet. The physical sensation for the sailors on the surface was one of absolute helplessness. As the heat from the burning oil on the water's surface became so intense, it began to melt the paint on the hulls of the surviving escort ships. The Taiwan Strait was no longer a strategic transit corridor, but a 12-kilometer-long graveyard of floating metal and oily fire that blotted out the sunrise with a wall of acrid, black soot. As the last of the B-52 bombers banked hard toward the east to begin their long journey back to Guam, the only sound left on the bridges of the remaining Chinese vessels was the roar of the wind and the rhythmic, hollow clanging of steel hulls colliding in the dark. The primary armored strike force of the invasion had been reduced to a collection of sinking, scrap, and burning fuel, the strategic momentum of the entire campaign broken by the unfiltered weight of 70,000 pounds of falling iron. This was the immediate aftermath of the rain of iron, where the silence of the sea was only broken by the distant, muffled thud of ammunition lockers cooking off, deep beneath the waves. The environment was a sensory nightmare, the air smelling of burnt rubber, scorched diesel, and the sharp, metallic tang of vaporized steel that hung in the humid atmosphere like a toxic fog. The water was thick, with debris-shattered lifeboats, pieces of armored plating, and the orange glow of life vests bobbing in the shadows of the massive, sinking hulks. For the Chinese commanders on the mainland, the radar screens told a story of total tactical collapse. As icon after icon of the transport fleet flickered and disappeared into the digital void, the bridge of fire had been extinguished, leaving behind a strategic vacuum that the People's Liberation Army could not fill, no matter how many missiles they launched in retaliation. 6 in the morning. The northern flank of the People's Liberation Army invasion force had ceased to exist as a coherent military unit. What had been a disciplined line of 60 transport vessels was now a jagged, 10-mile-long trail of wreckage, dominated by the towering, skeletal remains of the roll-on, roll-off ships. The sea, once a dark and indifferent highway, was now a viscous, orange-streaked nightmare of burning marine diesel and floating debris. The environment had transformed into a sensory assault. The natural smell of the salt spray was entirely gone, replaced by the choking, chemical stench of vaporized hydraulic fluid and the heavy, iron tang of scorched steel. The physical breakdown of the fleet was visible in the slow, agonizing death of the heavy transport Long March 64. The ship had taken 3 direct hits from 500-pound bombs, which had punched through the light civilian decking and detonated in the primary vehicle hold. Now, the vessel was listing 45 degrees to starboard, its massive bow rising out of the water like the head of a dying beast. Inside the hold, The restraints holding 40 Type 99A main battle tanks finally snapped under the extreme angle. The 45-ton machines, the pride of the armored division, became unguided projectiles. They slid across the oil-slicked decks with a deafening, shrieking grind of metal on metal, smashing through the reinforced bulkheads and puncturing the hull from the inside. Each tank that plunged into the dark water took with it the hopes of a successful northern landing, leaving behind only a massive, churning vortex that pulled smaller debris and surviving sailors into the black depths of the strait. Across the northern sector, the strategic momentum had evaporated. The invasion's northern flank was intended to be the hammer that would strike the port of Tamsui, but the hammer was now scattered across the seabed in pieces of shattered iron. Command and control had shattered along with the ships. On the surviving escort frigates, radar screens were a useless blur of false returns and smoke interference. The communication channels were a chaotic overlap of voices, ranging from frantic distress calls to the eerie, dead silence of units that simply no longer existed. The breakdown was total, not just of equipment, but of the very operational logic that had sustained the crossing. The survivors were no longer an invasion force. They were desperate mariners fighting a losing battle against fire and the relentless 2-meter swells of the strait. The destruction of 300 vehicles in a single 10-minute window represented a catastrophic loss of combat power that the Eastern Theater Command could not hope to replace in the current phase of the war. These were not just machines, but trained crews and the specialized equipment required for a high-intensity amphibious assault. As the fires continued to rage, the sky above the strait turned a sickly, dark gray, the sun struggling to penetrate the thick wall of soot and smoke. The physical sensation for anyone left on the water was one of profound isolation, as the massive plumes of black smoke acted as a visual barrier, cutting off each surviving ship from its neighbors and the mainland. In the distance, the remaining Type 55 destroyers began to pull back, their captains realizing that the mission to protect the transports was over. They moved through the water at reduced speed, their hulls vibrating with the resonance of secondary explosions still occurring beneath the surface. The logistics of the northern flank had been cut at the root. There would be no reinforcements, no fuel resupply, and no medical evacuation for the thousands of men trapped in the burning wreckage. The strait had become a wall of fire that effectively sealed the northern approach to Taiwan, turning the invasion's primary objective into a strategic impossibility. The aftermath was a graveyard of ambition. Hundreds of orange life vests bobbed in the oil slicks, glowing with a haunting brightness against the present dark water, while the larger pieces of wreckage, shipping containers, tank turrets, and sections of bridge clattered against each other in the bridge waves. The sound was a hollow, rhythmic thudding that seemed to keep time with the fading pulse of the invasion. By dawn, the time the first light of dawn finally touched the surface of the water, it revealed the full scale of the disaster. A 10-mile scar on the ocean where the Red Dragon had attempted to cross only to be broken and sent to the bottom by the cold, calculated weight of iron falling from the clouds. 6:15 in the morning. The flight of 6 B-52 Stratofortress bombers turned their heavy noses toward the east, beginning the 1,500-mile journey back across the Philippine Sea to the limestone runways of Andersen Air Force Base on Guam. The transition from the violent, high-intensity combat environment of the Taiwan Strait to the monotonous, long-haul cruise of the return flight was a jarring shift for the crews, who now felt the full weight of physical exhaustion and the lingering adrenaline of the bomb release. The cockpits, once vibrating with the roar of open bomb bays and the tension of the target run, were now filled with the low hum of avionics and the stale, recycled air of a pressurized cabin that smelled of cold coffee and sweat. Each pilot gripped the controls with hands that were finally beginning to steady, though the mental image of the blossoming fireballs on the water below remained etched into their vision like a photographic negative. The primary logistical challenge of the return journey was the final mid-air refueling contact. a critical maneuver required to ensure the heavily loaded bombers had enough fuel to reach Guam after 4 hours of high-power combat maneuvers. 3 KC-135 Stratotankers, which had been orbiting in a designated refueling track 300 miles east of the combat zone, moved into position to meet the returning flight. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, the physical connection between the tanker's refueling boom and the bomber's receptacle was a delicate, high-tension dance performed at 30,000 feet, where any sudden turbulence or pilot error threatened to sever the vital flow of JP-8 fuel. For 15 minutes, each bomber trailed behind its tanker like a nursing calf, receiving thousands of gallons of fuel through a reinforced steel pipe, while moving at 800 kilometers per hour through the thinning clouds of the upper atmosphere.
I see it.
Simultaneously, the Tactical Operations Center at Pacific Command began the grueling process of battle damage assessment, utilizing high-resolution imagery from orbiting Global Hawk drones and signals intelligence from the E-3 Sentry aircraft. The data was unequivocal. The 2 waves of carpet bombing had achieved a level of destruction rarely seen in modern maritime warfare, confirming the total loss of 300 armored vehicles and the sinking of 15 primary transport ships. The digital maps, which had been crowded, with red icons representing the invasion fleet only an hour earlier, now showed a fragmented cluster of stationary targets and a massive, growing oil slick that covered nearly 50 square miles of the Central Strait. This assessment was the cold, mathematical validation of the mission's success, proving that the northern spearhead of the People's Liberation Army had been effectively decapitated before it could reach the landing beaches. 300 miles to the southeast, Carrier Strike Group 11 was engaged in its own high-speed logistical cycle, recovering the FA-18 Gulf Growlers and F-35 Bravo fighters that had provided the essential electronic and kinetic shield for the bombers. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford was a choreographed chaos of purple-shirted fuelers and red-shirted ordnancemen, who worked with frantic speed to turn the aircraft around for the next potential sortie. Each jet that slammed onto the arrestor wires was immediately surrounded by teams checking for battle damage, heat stress fractures, and depleted ammunition counts, the air thick with the searing heat of jet blast and the sharp, metallic smell of hot brakes. The logistics of the carrier deck were the heartbeat of the fleet's endurance, ensuring that the air superiority umbrella remained intact even as the primary strike force moved out of the theater. As the bombers crossed the halfway point of their return flight, the mechanical strain of the mission began to show on the aging airframes, with one B-52 reporting a fluctuating oil pressure reading in engine number 4. The crew immediately initiated the shutdown procedure for the affected engine, a routine but tense operation that required the pilot to retrim the aircraft to compensate for the asymmetrical thrust of the remaining 7 engines. This was the reality of operating 40-year-old strategic assets in a high-intensity conflict. The success of the mission depended as much on the durability of the steel and the skill of the maintenance crews as it did on the accuracy of the bombs. The flight continued in a grim, silent formation, 6 gray giants cutting through the morning light toward a sanctuary that was still 2 hours of flying time away. The strategic objective of the return flight was not merely to save the aircraft, but to preserve the specialized crews and the mission-capable platforms for the inevitable second phase of the campaign. The United States Air Force and Navy were now operating on a global logistics clock, where every hour of flight time was measured against the remaining stockpiles of precision munitions and the mechanical fatigue of the fleet. By the time the lead Stratofortress finally sighted the white surf of the Guam coastline, the aircrews were already thinking about the next briefing, the next fuel load, and the next time they would have to fly into the teeth of the red horizon. The way home was long, but it was a path paved with the tactical certainty that the invasion had been blunted, and the northern flank of the strait was now a silent graveyard of iron. 7 in the morning. The Eastern Theater Command Headquarters. In Fuzhou. The atmosphere inside the subterranean command center, buried 300 meters beneath the granite cliffs of the mainland, was defined by a heavy, pressurized silence that felt as dense as the stone above. The air was cool and filtered, smelling of ozone and the sterile, metallic scent of high-powered server racks. But it could not mask the sudden, palpable tension of a catastrophe in progress. On the primary tactical display, a wall-sized liquid crystal screen, 40 feet wide, the icons representing the northern invasion pincer had turned from steady blue to a flickering, translucent gray. The strategic void was not a metaphor. It was a physical gap on the map, a 10-mile stretch of the Taiwan Strait where an entire elite armored division had simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. The loss of 300 Type 99A main battle tanks and 400 infantry fighting vehicles represented a decapitation strike against the very heart of the Chinese ground campaign. This was the heavy fist, the specialized units trained for years to execute the rapid breakout from the Tamsui beachheads and the subsequent encirclement of Taipei. Without this armor, the thousands of light infantry and paratroopers already committed to the initial airdrop operations were now effectively stranded, lacking the heavy fire support and mobile protection required to survive a concerted counterattack by Taiwanese defender forces. The Chinese commanders stood motionless, their faces illuminated by the cold, blue light of the screens as the realization of a total tactical miscalculation began to settle over the room like a cold fog. The command response was initially characterized by a frantic, uncoordinated attempt to salvage the remains of the northern flank. Orders were barked over encrypted lines to divert the southern invasion groups already heavily engaged near Kaohsiung to shift their assets toward the north, a logistical pivot that would take 48 hours they did not have. The strategic objective had been a synchronized, three-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the island's defenses through sheer mass and complexity. Now, with northern prong shattered and sinking into the strait, the entire operational timetable was in shambles. The logistics of moving hundreds of replacement tanks from the interior of the mainland to the coastal ports would require weeks, not hours, and the window of opportunity provided by the initial cyber attacks was closing fast. Inside the bunker, the physical sensation of the defeat was reflected in the frantic activity of the lower-level staff officers, who worked with trembling hands to update the casualty estimates and fuel consumption charts. The loss was not merely in steel and electronics, but in the highly specialized human capital required to operate the most advanced armored vehicles in the inventory. 3,000 trained tankers and mechanics were gone, representing years of institutional knowledge and combat readiness that could not be replaced by simple conscription. The strategic void extended into the very future of the Eastern Theater Command, leaving a hole in the order of battle that would take a decade to repair, even if the war ended that morning. On the American side, the tactical operations centers were already shifting their focus from the strike phase to the exploitation of the void. Satellite imagery confirmed that the Chinese had begun to pull back their remaining transport vessels from the northern transit corridors, creating a vacuum that the US Navy could now fill with its own hunter-killer submarine groups. The B-52 bombers had not just destroyed a column, they had altered the geometry of the entire theater, forcing the Chinese to retreat into a defensive posture to protect their surviving coastal assets. The strategic void acted as a buffer, a dead zone where the momentum of the invasion had ground to a violent, fiery halt, giving the defenders of Taiwan the first real breathing room they had experienced since the start of the blockade. As the sun rose higher over the mainland, casting long, sharp shadows across the coastal airfields, the Chinese high command faced a brutal choice: escalate to even more destructive, perhaps non-conventional, means of warfare, or accept that the primary objective of a rapid conquest was no longer possible. The strategic void in the strait was a silent witness to the limits of massed armor in the age of long-range heavy bombers. The environment of the command center remained cold and sterile, but for the men inside, it felt like the inside of a furnace, fueled by the burning wreckage of an entire division, and the realization that the red horizon had turned into a dark, inescapable abyss. 10 in the morning on the 13th of April, 2026. The first of the 6 B-52 Stratofortress bombers touched down on the heat-shimmering runway at Andersen Air Force Base, its tires screaming as they contacted the concrete at 250 kilometers per hour. The heavy aircraft settled onto its landing gear with a visible groan of stressed metal, trailing a thin plume of blue smoke from the scorched rubber as it slowed along the 3,000-meter strip of reinforced asphalt. This landing marked the conclusion of a 72-hour surge that had seen the Pacific bomber fleet fly more combat hours in 3 days than they typically logged in a calendar year, pushing both the men and the machines to the absolute edge of structural and psychological collapse. As the engines finally wound down into a low, metallic whistle, the aircrew descended the narrow ladder from the belly of the lead bomber, their movements slow and heavy with the weight of sleep deprivation. Their flight suits were stiff with salt and sweat, and their eyes were bloodshot from the constant strain of monitoring flight instruments through the vibration of 8 engines, for 12 hours at a time. The environment on the flight line was one of grim, quiet efficiency. There were no cheers or celebrations, only the rhythmic clanging of heavy wrenches and the low hum of cooling fans as maintenance crews swarmed the arriving aircraft. The price of defiance was etched into the faces of the pilots, who moved toward the debriefing rooms like ghosts, their minds still processing the data links and the white-hot flashes of the impact zone. The mechanical cost to the aircraft fleet was becoming a critical factor in the strategic planning for the next phase of the defense. Every airframe that returned showed signs of extreme operational stress, from fresh streaks of hydraulic fluid leaking from the landing gear wells to microscopic stress fractures beginning to spiderweb across the aluminum skin. Logistics officers worked frantically in the humid heat to manage a dwindling supply of specialized seals and gaskets, many of which had to be cannibalized from non-operational aircraft parked in the hangars. The air at the base smelled of hot oil and ozone, a sensory reminder that the massive industrial machine of the military force was being ground down by the very intensity of its own successful operations. Beyond the aircraft, the logistical strain extended to the base's primary fuel reserves and the stockpile of heavy munitions, which had been depleted by nearly 40% in the last 3 days of sorties. The fuel lines from the deep water tankers at the harbor were running at maximum capacity, pumping millions of gallons of fuel into the underground storage tanks to prepare for the next wave. This was the hidden, grueling reality of high-intensity warfare. For every hour of combat over the target zone, 20 hours of maintenance, and 3,000 tons of logistical support were required on the ground. The victory had been achieved, but it had left the primary strike force in a state of mechanical exhaustion that would take weeks of dedicated labor to fully repair. The human cost was equally profound, as the ground crews worked 18-hour shifts in the suffocating tropical humidity to ensure the bombers could be rearmed and refueled for the next tasking. The mental fatigue was a silent enemy, leading to a spike in minor maintenance errors and a general slowing of the operational tempo. As the adrenaline of the first strike began to fade into the reality of a long war, the commanders knew that they were trading the long-term health of their fleet for short-term tactical survival, a calculated gamble that had saved the region from a decisive armored breakthrough, but had left the shield of the Pacific dangerously thin. By noon, the flight line had settled into a deceptive stillness, with the 6 bombers sitting like gray monuments under the harsh Pacific sun, their engines silent for the first time in days. The strategic objective of the mission had been met with terrifying efficiency, but the price was visible in every leaking seal, every bloodshot eye, and every empty ammunition crate stacked behind the hangars. The defense of the strait had been purchased with the total exhaustion of the guard, leaving the military to wonder how much longer the aging Leviathans could continue to fly before the metal itself gave way under the weight of the mission. 1,800 hours. The western shore of the Taiwan Strait. The primary invasion fleet had completed its tactical withdrawal to the mainland ports, leaving the northern corridor of the sea to the currents and the silence. Where once 300 Type 99A main battle tanks had moved toward a certain victory, now only the rhythmic, hollow clanging of drifting steel remained. The air was thick with the lingering scent of burnt oil and the cold, damp mist of the evening tide. a sensory fog that clung to the surface of the dark water. The question of the northern landing had been settled, not by a clash of armies on the beach, but by the weight of iron, delivered from 30,000 feet. The iron graveyard now extended for 15 kilometers along the central transit lane, a dense field of floating wreckage and submerged hulls that acted as a physical barrier to any future amphibious attempts in the sector. Marine salvage experts from the 7th Fleet, operating under the protection of a continuous combat air patrol, began the grim task of identifying the largest navigational hazards to ensure the strait remained open for future Allied transit. The water was a dark, oily slick that smothered the natural waves, reflecting the flickering orange glows of the fires that still burned inside the half-submerged remains of the transport ships. Every piece of debris, from a shattered tank tread to a scorched life vest, told the story of a logistical miracle that had been turned into a catastrophe in less than 10 minutes of concentrated violence. The Chinese command had officially suspended all amphibious operations in the Northern Theater, shifting their remaining assets to a defensive posture behind the mainland's missile umbrella. The strategic objective of a rapid, 3-day conquest was now an impossibility, replaced by the grim reality of a long-term war of attrition that Beijing had desperately hoped to avoid. The loss of the armored division had created a psychological fracture within the Eastern Theater Command, as the realization that their primary offensive tool could be countered by aging heavy bombers forced a total reevaluation of their naval doctrine. Satellite imagery showed the ports of Ningbo and Fuzhou crowded, with damaged vessels and retreating troops, the momentum of the invasion blunted by the sheer weight of American airborne ordnance. On Guam, the logistics of the next phase were already in motion, proving that the victory was as much a product of the supply chain as it was the cockpit. Even as the B-52 crews began their mandatory rest cycles, 3 C-17 Globemaster transport aircraft landed at Andersen Air Force Base, their holds packed with fresh Mark 82 and Mark 84 bomb kits from the continental United States. The air bridge across the Pacific was a continuous, high-speed connection that ensured the bomber fleet would be fully rearmed within 24 hours, despite the mechanical exhaustion of the airframes. Ground crews, reinforced by fresh technicians flown in from Hawaii, began the process of deep maintenance on the lead bombers, stripping down the engines and patching the stress fractures in the wings under the glare of mobile floodlights. The price of the victory was a fleet that was functionally broken, but the logistics machine was already working to weld it back together for the next time the red horizon pulsed with intent. The final damage assessment was staggering in its clarity and was briefed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff within the hour. 300 main battle tanks destroyed, 400 infantry fighting vehicles lost to the sea, 15 primary transport ships sunk, with another 12 heavily damaged and forced to beach themselves on the mainland coast to avoid total loss. Estimates of personnel casualties among the Chinese invasion force exceeded 5,000, while the United States had suffered no aircraft lost and only minor mechanical damage to its primary strike platforms. It was a lopsided victory of industrial capacity and long-range precision over massed surface armor, a clear win for the United States Air Force and Navy that had preserved the independence of the island at a severe cost to the enemy's long-term combat power. As the first stars appeared over the Taiwan Strait, the fires on the water began to fade into the rising darkness, leaving only the cold shapes of the wreckage drifting toward the horizon. The war was not over, but the character of the conflict had fundamentally changed from a war of movement to a war of endurance. The burning strait was a warning to any power that believed mass steel could substitute for air superiority and electronic control of the battlefield. For the people of Taiwan, the night was no longer filled with the fear of a sunrise landing, but with the quiet hope that the bridge of fire had been broken for good. The strategic void remained, a silent and empty expanse of water that now served as the definitive border between two worlds.